crystals. And at that time, he worked at Fabrication University in the UK. Now he can lead a group with Max issue generally. And one of his earlier papers on photonic crystals optics ledger has been cited over 11 papers. So let's hear his pioneer work on photonic crystal fiber and later progress of this science. Let's welcome.
Microphone, I believe, hidden behind me. I hope it's helping you hear me. If you can't hear me, let me know, please. You can't hear me?
Not very well.
Not very well.
Where is all the microphone?
Was it a bit complicated here? I was shocked. This was a possibility. Lose my voice. Just here, back here. And you're going to have to put up with it because I can't change the machines here. I just discovered that this school is actually, most of you are interested in soft condensed matter, I think, is what I'm understanding. I come from a different field, really. I don't work with soft condensed matter at all, very little, except perhaps when you heat glass up it gets soft, maybe that's a soft material. I'm going to tell you about this type of fiber, this photonic crystal fiber. I'm going to talk about, first of all, what it is, what you can do with it, and then move on to, or rather during the course of the lectures, I'm going to touch on various different applications. Maybe some of the applications could be of interest to you. You're certainly hearing about one application, which is the lectures from Russel on putting crystals into the hollow channels in these fibers. But I'm not going to talk about that one. You've got plenty of opportunities to hear about that. So this is basically an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to talk through all these headings. I'll work my way through this. I'll see how time goes and whether things are interesting or not. I can hop around quite easily between the topics. But to start off, let's just have a look a little bit at the history of this. The idea for this dates back to 91. And if any of you remember 91, were working at that time, there was a lot of excitement about the proposal that you could make a photonic bandgap. In other words, you could create a material which had a bandgap for photons in very much the same way as the electronic bandgap in semiconductors. At that particular time, I was wondering, is there something interesting one could do, perhaps with optical fibers? Could one make an optical fiber that had some form of transverse periodic pattern in 2 dimensions? And if one could do this, maybe you could create a photonic bandgap, cladding and trap light in a hollow core in the middle. And I got a bit excited about this, but it was just notes in a notebook. And it was very unclear back at that time whether one could make anything like this. It seemed like it was almost impossible to imagine making something on a very small length scale, periodic, along the entire length, which could be kilometers. Because optical fibers could be 100 kilometers long. Could you actually ever do this? Well, of course, the short version now of the history is that it did work. It wasn't easy to make it work at first. It took quite a lot of different experiments and different approaches. And now there's a lot of different types of photonic crystal fiber. For example, in the background of this slide, everything on this picture is going to be on the scale. To scale, so that's a 10 micrometer diameter circle. What you're looking at in the background of this slide, these are 10 micrometer diameter rings, or rather tubes, of germanium filter glass. So the refractive index in these rings is slightly higher than the material in between. So here we have silicon dioxide, and here you have germanium doped silicon dioxide. These are the two materials used for making conventional optical fibers. These are the fibers that actually you use when you use the web. So they are the strands that connect the continents together with long-haul telecommunications. So fact, this is made by stacking the cores from single mode fibers into a ring and making a whole periodic lattice out of it. And in the middle, you see there's a missing ring. This is where the light is guided. In fact, this structure has photonic bandgap. There are lots and lots of other examples, of course. Here are some pictures, all of them to scale. So starting with very small, this is a fiber that has a solid glass core, which is 800 nanometers in diameter, so it's less than a micron. In fact, some of the features in the structure are well sub-micron in size. They're really nanoscale in size. We get down to glass webs, which are less than 100 nanometers thick. Some of these structures. I'll talk about what you can do with this in a while. Here is, in fact, a picture, and we'll talk about this too, a picture of the very first photonic bandgap guiding fiber. This was worked on at the University of Bath. This is a fiber that was designed by a company, Photonic, for an application in telecommunications. It has a very complex structure. I'll talk a bit about that during the course of the lecture. This is a fiber made from an extrusion process using what we call soft glasses. These are glasses that melt at lower temperature than silica, and so on around the various pictures. This is a birefringent fiber. It has two-fold symmetry in the structure, so it has birefringence. Here's a hollow core, optical fiber where the light is guided in a hollow core, and here finally is a hollow core fiber designed for telecommunications, which guides with extremely low loss at 1.5 micron wavelength. So a lot of different structures. I think this picture illustrates why it's so difficult. People ask me, what can you do with these fibers? Well, what do they do? What's special about them? I mean, there's so many different answers because there's so many different structures that it's impossible just to give a simple answer. Someone asked me specifically, can I do this with the fiber? Then maybe I could answer it. But to be able to cover all these different types of fibers in one sentence, one answer is impossible. It's interesting just to look at the whole field, and lots of people have got involved in the field. So it's been growing pretty fast in terms of published articles and citations and so on. This is the entire field. These are all the papers published on the various different types of fiber. And you've got photonic crystals, photonic bandgap fiber, you've got microstructured fiber, poly fiber, and there are even a few papers with poly fiber without the E. So just apart from showing that there are lots of different groups working on this, looking at applications, it is a bit important to make sure you don't spell it that way, because you might get misunderstood. This, after all, means poly, poly. In case anyone doesn't know what that word means. I used to make a joke right at the beginning. I wanted to make poly fibers, and I used to tell people, please, it has an E in the word, just in case they thought I was a bit crazy. Anyway, so we call them PCF. Whether you like the name or not, that's what we tend to call it anyway. Right. So the next question might be, how on earth do you make something like this? So let's have a look at the fabrication process. First of all, let me show you what didn't work. So one of the very first approaches that we tried involved taking a stub, a little piece of silica glass, silicon dioxide, and drilling holes into it. There's a picture of its end face. So this was done with a diamond drill, and these are 1 millimeter in diameter. These small holes for the core, somewhat larger. So we were really going for gold here, as we say. We wanted to get a hollow core photonic bandgap guiding fiber with just with one easy step. Of course, impossible. You can't really do that. It proved impossible to drill the hard silica glass, especially for the small holes. So all the drills broke, so we just kind of gave up at that point. However, this technique does work quite well for soft materials like polymers and some of the more soft, glassy materials. You can actually drill them. And then having drilled the whole thing, you can see it's about 2 centimeters in diameter. You can then heat the thing up and draw it down to the fibers. That's what they grow. Anyway, this wasn't a very good approach. So we then thought a lot and tried many different techniques, and we ended up with actually what is quite a simple procedure. What we do is we take the pillaries, tubes of material made from silicon dioxide, and these are about 1 millimeter in diameter. The reason for 1 millimeter is very simple, but if you make, it's not my computer.
Your laptop will also power.
No.
Disconnect.
No, it's not. It's going fine. Your projector just disconnected. It's not disconnected. The reason we use pillaries of 1 millimeter diameter is that they're quite stiff. They don't bend very much. So you can have a 1 meter length of 1 millimeter pillar made from silica, and it's quite stiff. This means that it's possible to stack them into a kind of preform of the structure that you want. And because we're stacking individual tubes, you can build up quite a complex structure. You can add in solid rods of silica. You can add in some dopants into the glass if you wanted to make a laser or an amplifier. And you can make more complicated structures, such as a birefringent structure, which is thicker wall tubes on either side of the core with a solid glass core. You can even leave out a tube and make a hollow core in some regions. So you can really build up the structure you want, and it's on a very large scale, because this whole thing is maybe 20 millimeters across. So it's a big, thick object. Then you bind it with wire and put it into a fiber drawing furnace, which is a furnace running at high temperature, where the glass softens and all the tubes stick together, and you can draw the thing down to the size. And in fact, you can collapse the dimensions of the individual tubes by about a factor of 10,000 or even 50,000, so, and end up with a very fine structure at the end, even though you started with something large. So this is like an alternative to lithography. And the traditional approach to making very small things is to use electron beam lithography and try and make it, at the actual dimensions that you want to use it. But here we're starting with something big and using the magical, almost magical properties of glass, reducing it in size down to the dimensions that we want at the end. In fact, this technique dates back a long way. It turns out that it's been used thousands of years ago. And this is a picture from the Corning Museum in Corning in New York of a kind of, call it, a neck decoration from a statue, which was made in exactly the same way. The patterns in this glass, this polished glass sample, were made by using colored glass and forming a picture with the colored glass, and then fusing it together and drawing it, I think, down in size a bit, and then polishing it. So you can make some very beautiful things this way. So they got there first. The other way that we sometimes use for making these fibers is extrusion, and this is well known. Anyone who makes pasta, for example, pasta is made by extrusion. I understand pasta was invented in China, by the way. The Italians think they invented it anyway. That's an Italian piece of pasta. But you can use the same approach for making fibers, and here are some examples. This is the die, this is the metallic die made for producing a structure like this. And the glass is forced through the spaces, and then it comes together afterwards, and you can end up with various structures, such as these ones down below. So this is quite a good process. This is a recent paper from the group in Adelaide, in Australia. They've been doing some very nice things using this procedure. So this is a good process for materials that melt at lower temperature, such as compound glasses and polymers, for example. Okay, so that's how we make them. I'd like to make some general comments about how they work. A generalized kind of picture of the guidance mechanisms in these fibers. So let's just talk in a very general way about how a structure like this might operate as a wavelet for light. So here's a pretty general structure. It's made from two materials, material A and material B. And the material A, in this case, is the material inside the hollow channels. We filled these hollow channels with the material, so it could be that these might be just empty. It could be filled with some other material, all sorts of possibilities. I'm saying nothing about the relative refractive indices of these two materials at the moment. Simply, what I am saying is a periodic structure of some sort of the two materials. Okay, so let's just think now. We'd like to have in the center of this photonic crystal periodic lattice of elements, we like to be able to guide light to the core, and the question is, how should we do that? Is it possible in a structure like this to guide light to the core like that? And one way to decide this is to think about just jump back, to think about the properties of this periodic material in the cladding. And we can use the conventional approach that's used in solid-state physics for working out the electronic band gaps. We can have a look and we can draw the unit cell, use the unit cell for that particular structure, material A, material B, and of course we do is we build up a crystal from that, and here are a few more unit cells. And then we ask the question, well, if I have a field, say, at some point in this unit cell, I can, by solving Maxwell's equations, I can actually work out the field in the adjacent unit cell and work out the transfer matrix that takes me from here to here. I call that matrix M, and then I can solve for the eigenvalues of that matrix, and I get a couple of eigenvalues, and you can show that the two eigenvalues that you get for this matrix, the product of the two eigenvalues, equals 1 always. This is a unitary matrix, this is what you expect, it's just like this. The eigenvalue, the product of the eigenvalues is 1. So, given that the product of the two eigenvalues is 1, we have two possibilities. One is that the eigenvalues are real values. So this might be, say, 6. This might be 1 over 6. And that would mean that the field grows by a factor of 6 every time it goes to the next unit cell. Or it falls by a factor of 6 to 1/6 to 1/36 and so on. And those are the conditions for exponential decay and exponential growth of the fields. And in fact, under those circumstances, just like you get in an electronic band gap, inside the band gap, the eigenvalues of the electronic wave functions are real values that have an evanescent situation. There are no real photonic states. So light, in other words, is not able to exist in this structure. There are no states. However, another possibility is that the eigenvalues are complex. This might be a complex number with magnitude 1 and some phase, and the other eigenvalue would be the same at magnitude 1 and the conjugate phase. So the product then equals 1. And this is what you need for propagation, because if the eigenvalues are just a complex number with magnitude 1, the fields do not grow or decay from unit cell to unit cell, but the phase changes by a certain amount. So you get a certain phase change from here to here, same phase change again, same phase change again, and that indicates that, in other words, the light fields are able to propagate, you're not losing any power. The fields have the same amplitude in every unit cell with just a change in phase. And of course, the rate of change in the phase tells you what the phase velocity of the propagating wave is. You get a certain phase change per unit length, which is the same as a wave vector, a block wave. Okay. So what we have to do to trap light in this core, in the center here, we have to make sure that the eigenvalues in the cladding material are real value. We can do it many.
没事。那上下课的时间，何老师，这个是上下课的标志，没有事儿，一会儿就没了。
All right. So then, having got that out of the way, this idea of band gaps and so on, let's now just think about the wave vectors in a structure like this in a different way. So I'm going to take a length of fiber, and I'm going to say I'm going to fix the optical frequency, and I'm going to set the wave vector along the axis to some value beta. So I'm going to set that wave vector, and you know from any of the boundary conditions that that wave vector will be conserved, will have the same value in every region of the fiber because it's translationally invariant along the axis. That should be beta, by the way. So the axial wave vector is conserved. Okay, what does this tell us? Well, we could go into one particular region of the structure with refractive index n1 and vacuum wave vector k. So this is the wave vector of a free traveling wave in that material, and we're splitting that wave vector into two components, a component beta along the axis and a transverse component k sub t1. Okay, well this is very simple stuff, I suppose, but what is important in these structures is this transverse wave vector, this k sub t, because you can interpret that as as having an effective wavelength. 2 pi over this k gives you an effective wavelength in the transverse plane. And one of the things about photonic crystals, as we call them, or just periodic structures that interact strongly with light, one of the things that we hear about them is that the period has to be on the same length scale as the optical wavelength. If you ever hear anyone say that again, please put your hand up and ask them what they mean by wavelength, because it's a very inaccurate statement. Because the wavelength can take almost any value from a very small value to infinity. And you can see that from here, that if I choose the beta value to be large, quite large, very close to k times n1, k sub t gets very small, and the transverse effective wavelength becomes enormous. So I could actually make a photonic crystal for light in which the period was a meter. It might be difficult to make it, but it would work. It would be enormous, but it would work because I can make the effective wavelength of the light very, very long just by playing around with components of wavelength. And this works in 2 dimensions, of course. It wouldn't work in a 3-dimensional crystal, but it works in a structure like this. And this also makes it easier to make the fiber because the dimensions of the crystal do not have to be very, very tiny. Because this effective wavelength is bigger, it makes it easier to make the stuff. So I'm going to dive into some mathematics, just in case some of you are thinking of doing some modeling on this, where I did say we solve Maxwell's equations. Of course, you can express Maxwell's equations in many different ways. The most common way to express Maxwell's equations for photonic bandgap calculation is with the frequency or the vacuum wave vector squared as an eigenvalue. So you simply can write it down like this. Let's explain all the different things here. These operators are transverse operators, delta sub p. The important thing to notice is that the operator on the left here, that operates on the magnetic field in this case, the operator on the left contains the details of the structure, dielectric constant of the structure, the periodicity, all the details of that depends on the position in the transverse plane, and it contains the wave vector, the axial wave vector beta. So we put in the details of the structure, we put in the axial wave vector, and out from the calculation come the eigenvalues, the frequencies. And if you're working in photonics, this is not really what you want, because typically speaking, you're working with a laser, the laser frequency is fixed, and you'd like to know what the modes are. You don't really want to be specifying the wave vector and working out all the different frequencies that will give you that wave vector, because every one of these frequencies, that would be in a different laser. So actually, although this is a mission problem, so you can easily solve it using conventional code that's available on the web, or it's very easy to solve this equation, but it takes some time. It's not terribly useful because you have to iterate to make sure all the frequencies are the same. A nicer way to do it is to, so here we input the structure, the axial wave vector, and we get the frequency in this case. Another way to do this is to express Maxwell's equations in a different way, with beta squared as the eigenvalue. Then the operator becomes a bit more complicated, but here we put in the structure, we put in the vacuum wave vector, the frequency, and if we solve this equation, we can then get as eigenvalues beta squared, which is the axial wave vector, which is the way around we want it. So this means we can take the structure and frequency, and we get the wave vector. So this means that we can work out all the modes of the structure, all the different values of beta for a given frequency. This is a non-Hermitian problem, unfortunately, so it's slightly more complicated to solve, but it's not really all that difficult, it turns out. So if you do solve the equations, what do we end up with? I'm going to look now at a hexagonal lattice of silica and air. These are hollow channels, it's glass in between, and it's got a certain filling fraction of air, 45%, which reminding you beta is the component of wave vector along the axis. We now solve Maxwell's equations and put the results up on a diagram. I'm plotting here the normalized frequency. This is the omega times the pitch, the spacing between the holes, divided by c, this being the line in vacuum, the normalized frequency parameter, and the normalized wave vector parameter, beta times the pitch, along the horizontal axis. So quite a simple diagram. But let's first of all think about the hollow regions, the regions where there's really nothing there, it's just some air, refractive index of 1. Well, we can draw a line on this diagram that takes you from, but that is, it's got a slope of 1 on this, in these normalized units, and on the left-hand side of this line, with the light is free to propagate. On the right-hand side of the line is evanescent. What happens over here is that the value of beta is larger than the vacuum wave vector. And if beta is larger than the vacuum wave vector, that transverse effective wavelength I talked about a moment ago becomes imaginary, so the light is unable to propagate. The fields are evanescent, so we have no propagation. Alright, back to the vacuum. We can do the same thing for the glass, which is the material in between the holes. And in this case, the line for vacuum gets shifted over by a factor of about 1.46 in this case. So we now have a line over here, propagation, evanescence. Again, that's just for the silica material. So that's the two components that make up the fiber. There's the empty space and there's the glass. But it's a composite material. It's a mixture of these two materials. So what would you expect? You'd expect the refractive index, you'd expect a line, so somewhere lying between. Makes sense. Exactly what Maxwell's equation tells you. The effective refractive index of the material lies in between these two lines, and this is what Maxwell's equation tells you. Once again, we have propagation on the left, evanescence on the right. And in fact, this line actually hides something very important. I'll show you in a moment, which is that the photonic crystal, this composite structure, has very strong dispersion. That's to say, the effective refractive index of this material changes strongly with frequency. But that's not the end of the story, because we also find that there are regions where there are full two-dimensional photonic band gaps. There are these thin fingers coming down from the top right, and inside these fingers there are no photonic states. Inside these fingers, that transfer matrix has real eigenvalues, so the fields are evanescent. And even more exciting, this is what excited me when we did this goes back a long way actually, these calculations, but was that these band gaps do extend into the vacuum region, in the region where light is free to propagate in the vacuum. So we have a situation where light can be free to propagate in empty space, but it cannot actually propagate inside the solid material. Okay? Why that's important will come clear later. If you look at the same diagram, exactly the same diagram for a conventional single mode fiber, with the germanium doped core and silica cladding, we once again have the vacuum lines with the material outside the fiber. We have the silica line, which is the material in the cladding, and we have the germanium doped silica line, which is the core. And this is it's less than 1% higher in refractive index than the cladding, so it's very, very close to the silica line. So the whole of conventional fiber optics takes place in this very thin strip of territory on this very large area diagram, just in this very, very thin strip. So you're very restricted in what you can do. There's not all that much you can do with single mode fiber apart from using the telecoms for the transmitting light. But you compare that with this diagram, you can see there's a lot more possibilities, a lot more things you can do when you use periodicity. Okay, so let's now talk about photonic band gaps. And I just wanted to, just in case some of you don't know what they are, I guess it's students from all sorts of different backgrounds. So some of you know this, some of you don't, I would guess. So let me just talk about photonic band gaps. What is it exactly? What are photonic band gaps? Well, we all know that there's something to do with the Bragg condition, and we probably all understand what the Bragg condition is. We can make a periodic structure consisting of a whole lot of planes with spacing lambda, and if we just take the reflection from each plane to be very weak, and we send in some light at different angles, you'll find that it's one particular angle the light is strongly reflected. We get a strong cumulative reflection, and this angle, of course, is the Bragg angle. And the Braggs observed this with X-rays in crystals. They weren't using lasers; they didn't have them. But for light, it's exactly the same phenomenon. And it's a very sharply defined angle when the light gets reflected. So sharply defined only when the reflection is very weak from each plane, because then you get lots and lots of reflections, and they all have to add up in phase to give this strong reflection. And there's, of course, the well-known law that tells you what the angle is. But photonic band gaps also got to do with kind of switching light off, just saying preventing light from existing in the first place, not really switching it off like you switch it off with the switch on the wall. this is actually making it impossible for light to exist at all. So it's a rather different thing. So to do this, we need to make the reflections from each Bragg plane very strong. And if you do that, what you find is that the Bragg condition becomes uncertain. It's no longer a very sharp angle. In fact, for strong enough reflection, you get a whole range of angles where the light is unable to get inside the material. It's very strongly rejected from the material, so you have a forbidden range of angles. And the idea then is to add some more sets of planes, and if you arrange that the forbidden range of angles is greater than 120 degrees, and also it has to work, and you also, so under these circumstances the light is unable to get inside the material because of all these reflections. And if you also make sure that there are no states inside the crystal, there might be some states inside, you want to make sure they aren't there either, then this is what you need to get a full two-dimensional photonic bandgap. So it's a very special thing. It's not just something that people just say it's the Bragg condition. A lot of people describe the stop bands as just a Bragg reflection as a bandgap, and I really don't like that because it's not a bandgap. It's something very well known. It's a Bragg reflection. It only happens at one very sharp angle of incidence. The concept of the photonic bandgap really was a radical change in the way we think about these structures, and I think it should be used just for in situations where there's genuinely something new about what's going on, where we're really suppressing all the modes inside this material, preventing light from existing at all. Okay, well, once you've done that, you can then make, just by making a material that looks a bit like that construction, so take away the construction lines, we end up, it looks like a crystal, not surprisingly. And to do this, you need to, generally speaking, to have a high index contrast. This is usually the case, except in the fibers, this is not always true. You don't always need a high index contrast, but anyway, in most cases you do. And you need to make the crystal lattice quite carefully, design the shape of the unit cell quite carefully. Now, if you do that, you can make a hole in the middle and trap light inside it, using the bandgap to block the light from escaping, creating a little space where the light is able to oscillate. And of course, an extension to that is you could make a fiber, photonic bandgap fiber, so the light is trapped by photonic bandgap. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about classification here. This is actually remarkably difficult to classify the different kinds of photonic crystal fibers. Partly because the refractive index has a habit of changing with wavelength, and so when you think the refractive index difference is say, positive at one wavelength, it actually swaps sign in some other wavelength. So it's kind of tough to come up with definitions that are satisfactory. And the one that I think really, the one classification which is useful is the sign of the core cladding index difference in the limit where the wavelength is very long. This turns out to be the scalar limit. So we had a structure like this with one of the materials A inside the holes in this case, and material B, material in between the holes. And in the long wavelength limit, we can simply take the area average of the refractive indices and work out the refractive index in this limit. So for example, the refractive index difference so the refractive index difference between the core and the cladding would then take this form in the limit of long wavelength. So we have the core index minus the square root of the square of the refractive index in region A times the area of region A in the unit cell plus NB squared, the refractive index in the white material times the area in the unit cell of material B. Okay? We're divided by the total area of the unit cell, take the square root, and this then gives you this represent area average refractive index in the limit of long wavelength. So this definition then with this definition we can say that there are two different kinds of fibers. There are those for which delta n infinity is greater than naught, in which case the refractive index in the core is higher than in the cladding. So we have conventional refractive index guidance as total internal reflection. But it's worth just noticing that actually because of the dispersion of the refractive index, the sign of this can change at shorter wavelength. So it could actually become an anti-guide at shorter wavelength. And then the other definition is when delta n infinity is less than naught, in which case you can only get guidance by a bandgap effect, because index guidance is not possible at any wavelength in this particular case, at least when you only have two materials. I mean, if you made the core index deliberately different from that of the other materials, then this wouldn't be true. But if you're just working with two materials, this statement is true. So this is a very convenient definition. So just to emphasize that, so for example, a hollow core fiber with a hollow core and some kind of photonic crystal cladding would have delta n infinity less than naught, because the core index is less than the cladding, whereas a solid core version with glass in the core has delta n infinity greater than naught. Okay, so what I want to do here is to talk about scaling. And this is actually, you may think, well, I'm just talking about scaling, or we want to hear about some application. But this is actually very important for understanding fibers, and very, very useful. Particularly for some of the things that some of you may be doing with these fibers. You may be wanting to fill the holes with another material, a liquid maybe, or a liquid crystal, or something like that. So it's very important to understand how the properties of the electromagnetic properties of the fibers scale as you change the refractive indices in different material, different parts of the structure. So this is the result. There's a paper on this if you want to look at the details. I just skipped over a few slides because I thought this would be enough. So in the scalar case, when we can ignore the vector nature of the fields, it turns out, you can show this quite simply, that if you keep this parameter, this V parameter, V effective, if you keep V parameter constant, then you get identical behavior. And what is the V parameter? Well, it has the scale length, lambda. This might be the spacing between the holes, some characteristic length of the structure, of the entire structure, so that's the core plus the cladding. Underneath here is the vacuum wavelength of the light. And inside the square root, we have the difference of the squares of the two refractive indices. Now, if you keep V effective the same, you will have the same solutions. You will have the same modes. The fiber will behave in the same way. Now, that's important because, for example, we could have a fiber that had hollow regions where Na is 1 and Nb is some other value, and we change that, say to 1.5, and this is some higher number. Then this difference of squares would change, but if we change the pitch and keep the effective the same, or we change the wavelength and the effective is the same, we get exactly the same mode. It's a very useful concept. So if you're thinking of putting liquid or something into the hollows, then please have a look at this paper and use this scale law. You do need to be a little bit careful here because this is a scalar approximation. And if you make the refractive index difference very, very large, then the vector effects begin to be important and the scaling law no longer really works. But it does work pretty well in most cases. I'm just going to show you what does happen if you for the breakdown of the scalar approximation. So on the left here, this is a diagram, frequency versus some eigenvalues of an analysis. You don't need to worry too much about this. It's more or less frequency versus wave vector. And these red regions are band gaps, regions where the light is unable to propagate. So this is for a small refractive index contrast in this case, really quite small. We get band gaps with a certain structure. This is predicted very well by the scalar model. But if we take exactly the same geometry and we increase the refractive index to 1.45, in this case, then you can see the diagram has changed quite radically. If the scalar approximation worked, these both diagrams would be exactly the same. So these are band gaps. This is density of states, the color. So when it's white, it's a high density of states. When it's dark, it's a low density of states. And when it's red, the density of states is 0. Okay. So you can see it's changed radically whenever the refractive index difference is large. So one needs to be a little careful under those circumstances. But nevertheless. Okay. So I'm going to here. How long should I go for that? That's 45 minutes.
Yes. It's up to you. You want to finish?
I'll just finish this little section. Yeah. Okay. You may notice that there are some sort of features running vertically down these plots. And in fact, these correspond to resonances in the low index cylinders. This is a short board. You can use it. So you have So this is a hollow cylinder. You can work out that a Bessel function, the first lobe of the Bessel function J0 fits inside that cylinder, and this in fact corresponds to what we call a resonance or a unique resonance of the cylinder. It's not a trapped or bound mode. It's what's called a free resonance. It talks to the outside world, and it fits inside the cylinder. You can work out the conditions for the various different types of Bessel functions that fit inside the cylinder and plot them on this diagram. And in fact, these features correspond to resonances of the hollow cylinders in this case. They match very nicely with the theory. Okay. Finally, just before I stop, this is only a short thing. This is about some other basics of the fibers about nonlinearity, and I mean optical nonlinearity. If you're doing any kind of nonlinear optical experiment, you want to make a switch, you want to work with solitons, or you want to create lots of colors of light using nonlinearity, you need to have a certain amount of Kerr nonlinearity in the material. And there's a definition of fiber nonlinearity. For those of you not familiar with this, it's called gamma. This is a parameter this is the name we use for this parameter. It's basically a measure of the strength of the nonlinearity, the effective nonlinearity in the fiber. So it's inversely proportional to the size of the core, the size of the mode, I should say. If you make the mode very, very tiny, and you put a certain amount of power in, you get a very big intensity. If you make the core bigger, with the same amount of power, the intensity is lower, so clearly this is important. N2 is just the nonlinear refractive index, the Kerr coefficient, and the vacuum wave vector is in here as well. And if you work it all out, it can also be written in this form, and it has the units of watt per meter. So you put in more power, you get a high value, you put in more length, you get a large value. Now, if you look at all the different types of PCFs, we've got a very wide range of different structures. We have structures where the core is essentially empty, there's nothing in the core, and the light is concentrated in the core, very little of the light is in the glass. We can go to a structure where the light is in a core pretty much the same as a conventional optical fiber, or we can go to a very, very tiny core, which is a micrometer in diameter perhaps. So we go all the way from relatively low intensity because the core is big, but also there's no material in there, so N2 is very tiny. Maybe N2 is even 0 in the core. Down to a structure where the intensity is very high and the N2 is high. And the result of that, when you put numbers in, you have to be careful doing calculations, but you put numbers in for this gamma value, if you have a conventional fiber, you get about 20 per watt per kilometer for a conventional fiber. So this means you put 1 watt and you go a distance of a kilometer, you get a phase change of about, 3 times 2 pi. So about 6 pi phase change in that case. If we take a very small course, the PCF, we can go about 10 times higher. This is by making the core 1 micrometer in size. If we go to a different material, of course, we can boost the value again. Glass that has a higher N2. But the most dramatic is the hollow core, where we can go right down to a very tiny value because there is no material in the hollow core. So we have a vast range. I don't know how many orders of magnitude is it. Go all the way from 240 down to 4 orders of magnitude, 10 to the 4 times ratio of the nonlinear value. And this is very exciting for fiber optics people, because sometimes you want nonlinearity, you like high nonlinearity. People who do nonlinear optics, they want it. Sometimes you don't want it at all. And in telecommunications, nonlinearity is often a nuisance. If you want to deliver very high powers of laser light, you don't want nonlinearity. So there are lots of situations where you'd like to have a low nonlinearity. Equally, there are situations where you'd like a high nonlinearity. So it's nice to have this ability to engineer the value of the effective nonlinearity over a wide range. Okay, we'll break there.
Can you talk a little bit more about what defines photonic bandgap as opposed to this prime time complexity? I wasn't quite sure, but where can you get precise definition of what is it?
Definition is very simple. It's essentially if you can by designing the, let me go back, let me get a picture. Where was I? So if I just took one set of planes here, just one set like this. This has been known forever, forever, 100 years, maybe even longer, that if you send a wave into a periodic structure, you get reflection, and over a certain range of angles, you get what is known as a stop band. So people call it a stop band. Stop band is a better word, I think, in English at least. And over this range, there are no photonic states. The block waves that exist inside the structure are immensely. Okay? But you have not created a photonic band gap at all in this case. You've done nothing special, nothing new about that at all. The language exists for describing what's going on here and has existed for a long, long time. So why is it that people got so excited at the end of the 1980s with this concept of photonic band gap? Well, the reason there was that they realized that if you could generalize the periodicity and make it a two-dimensional periodic structure, and if you design it correctly, you could actually not just have a certain direction, light going in and getting ejected, and outside that range of directions it propagates inside the material, go in other directions and easily propagate through the material. But you can actually switch off all photonic states inside. You can make it impossible for light to exist at all, except as evanescent fields, which have to penetrate somehow within a certain range of frequencies. If you could do that, that was something completely exciting and new. This is why it bothers me, because I've got a sense of the history. When people just describe almost anything as having a photonic background, it's just nonsense. It's not true. And of course, the most dramatic, most exciting thing of all is the three-dimensional photonic band gap. I'm working with two-dimensional ones, and they're exciting enough for me. But to do it in 3 dimensions, then you're making, in a structure like this, light can come in from here and go through the structure clearly. There's no barrier to propagate. That's why the fibers work. But if you make a 3-dimensional periodic structure, given that we live in 3-dimensional space, light can't exist at all inside it. There are no photonic states. That is more sort of intriguing and fascinating. So I think that, to me, the definition is pretty clear.
Certainly for a single wavelength though?
No, it works over a wide range of wavelengths, usually. It depends on the design, if the refractive index difference is very
okay, for a range, but not for all.
It doesn't work for all frequencies. So that would be the ideal, switch off light for all eternity, and so you have to have a photonic band gap that works in 4 vector space, for a period of time. So that's a good idea, maybe we could do that.
Is there such a thing as a 1D photonic band gap?
I don't think so. I wouldn't use the word.
Any other questions? Can we take a break?
Okay.
Come back in 10 minutes?
And so on, for some of the stuff I've been talking about. There is a website that someone said didn't work. Maybe something to do with Chinese web or even my website. I'm not really sure what I gave was correct. But I'll check it and let you know tomorrow. If you want a review about the fibers themselves, this might be useful. This is 2006 paper on light technology. Quite a long paper covering a lot of the stuff that's in this paper. Although some of the more recent results are not in. All right, so we finished off just a moment ago talking about various things, and I talked about classification. Now I'm going to use this classification to talk about 2 different kinds of fibers. one where the delta n infinity is positive and the other where it's negative. So let's get on to the case where delta n infinity is possible. And in one particular example, which is the endless and single mode version of the fiber, and here's just a schematic of it. This is a fiber which has an array of hollow channels, and the core itself is formed by leaving out one of the channels, so just emitting it and filling it with glass. So we have a solid glass core. And this particular kind of fiber is maybe it's obvious to some of you. It wasn't obvious to us, and I'll tell you in a moment why. Maybe it could guide light by total internal reflection, because the refractive index in the core is higher than the refractive index in the cladding, at least on average. So the idea is that this might guide light if you do it correctly. So let's just think about this. If we put light in the core, it's traveling in the silica. So the core is made from solid silica glass, so the light is propagating in the silica, so it has to be propagating waves. And for that to be true, the value of beta, this wave vector component along the fiber, has to be such that k, for the light to be in the core, you find that the ratio of beta, the wave vector along the axis divided by the vacuum wave vector, is greater than 1. You could excite it in such a way that this is not greater than 1, but for the conditions in this picture, the conditions are that the beta over k is greater than 1. Now, under those circumstances, the light is evanescent in the hollow channels. So, if you imagine light coming in from some angle in the glass, hitting the hollow channel, it finds there are no states inside this hollow channel because total internal reflection is just preventing light from traveling in the hollow channel. You might get a bit of tunneling through evanescent tunneling through the evanescent region. You get a strong reflection, and there may also be some scattering in other directions, of course. But basically, this air channel corresponds to a very strong barrier to light. So light comes along, hits it, it sees this as a very strong barrier, it gets strongly reflected. So this gives you kind of unconditional evanescence in these holes. You don't need to worry about band gaps or anything. It's straightforward, very strong reflection. So with that picture, now let's look at the very first. I call it a cage for light, so, because we're kind of trapping light in what looks more like a cage than a waveguide. So here's the structure. It's the very first fiber we made back in 1995. It's the structure I told you that the air channels are quite narrow because the fabrication was pretty primitive, pretty early. And if we take a closer look, this is supposed to be the region where the light is guided with the missing air channel in the middle. You notice the channels themselves, the hollow channels are relatively narrow. And you could ask the question, if I put light in the core, why does the light not just, go out between the gaps? It seems no particular reason why the light just can't, because it's the same material here and here. You put light in here, wouldn't it just go out and escape between these barriers, these hollow channels? So when you looked at it in that way, it would seem that this cannot be a waveguide. How can it work? On the other hand, you could say, well, I put light in the core, and if I take the average refractive index here, I kind of average it, then the refractive index in the cladding is going to be lower than in the core because the hollow channels bring the average index down a little bit, so we can get total internal reflection. So we have two reasonable physical pictures, it seems. They both seem to make sense, but you reach a totally different conclusion. In one case, it's a waveguide because the total internal reflection can work. In the other case, light just leaks away because everyone knows that rays of light just go between, they just escape. We have these two conflicting pictures. Of course, we didn't work it out actually. We discussed this before we made the fibers. And we didn't reach a conclusion because we were very close to making it. We made it the following day. And this is the result. We coupled light into it. It guided light very nicely. But the really curious thing was that we tried lots of different wavelengths of light. We tried ultraviolet light up to infrared light, every possible wavelength. And for no wavelength could we see any evidence that there were higher order modes in the core. And these are modes where the not just a single lobe, but there are several lobes in the core. So it seemed as if the fiber was single mode at all wavelengths, or endlessly single mode. The far field pattern, by the way, has a kind of hexagonal symmetry, which you might expect because of the symmetry of the near field. But apart from that, it's a single mode. So this was an interesting observation, and you can explain it in various different ways. One way to explain it is by saying that the high order modes are filtered away. So whereas the fundamental mode, the one that sits in the core and fills the entire core with one single lobe, is unable to to escape because it's too big to squeeze between the hollow channels. It simply can't fit. You can't push it between those hollow channels because it's too big. So this makes it look like a cage. When you put a bird in a cage, it doesn't fly away because the bars of the cage are close enough to prevent that from happening. That's a bird singing. A little break. Good try. Okay, good. Now we can resume. There's another way to look at it is to use the picture I used before, which is you take a unit cell and you work out its clock flows and so on, and we arrange that the waves are evanescent inside the photonic crystal, and so we have, you can say then that the unit cells are anti-resonant with the core mode, and when you put light in the core mode, it has a certain wave vector associated with the mode, a certain beta value for a certain frequency, and for those values of those parameters, the cladding has what you might describe as a photonic band gap, or I mean, it's not quite a photonic band gap in this case because you can also explain it using total internal reflection, but it's nevertheless a periodic structure. Anyway, the result of this is that the fundamental mode cannot squeeze between the air holes in the cladding, whereas the higher order modes, which have smaller lobes, in this case, these smaller lobes are able to communicate with the cladding very easily, and in fact the light can leak away. In fact, this is true for all the higher order modes. They're all sort of able to leak away, and we end up then with a fiber that just supports the fundamental mode. So coming back to those two pictures I talked about, one picture said that the average refractive index in the cladding was lower, so it's a waveguide by total internal reflection. Well, that's true, because this is the picture that explains that. This is the mode in the core. Refractive index in the cladding is lower. The mode is actually sampling the average refractive index in the cladding, so it sees it and it's well guided in that case. Whereas the higher order modes are able to leak away because the ray picture works. The light is able to leak out, following its rays between the gaps between the air holes and the escape. So it turned out that both those pictures were correct. It's just that one picture applied to the fundamental mode, and the other picture applied to all the other modes of the structure might support. So if we look at our diagram that you've seen already, we think about putting a core in the middle. This projector's not very good here, actually. Colors are missing. It's not a very good projector, I'm afraid. You can't really see the structure still. So here's the diagram we saw before, and what we're doing here is we're choosing a frequency, and we are operating at a point like this one. So for the solid core in the middle, the light is guided by total internal reflection, and you can see that here, that this point is on the right-hand side of the PCF cladding line. So the light is evanescent in the photonic crystal fiber cladding, but it's propagating in silica because it's on the left-hand side of the silica line. So we are able to form a guided mode of this condition. We can also take this diagram, and instead of plotting this beta value, we can plot the effective index. We can plot beta over k along here, so we get a sense of the refractive index. So the same diagram. This is k times the pitch, lambda. That's a bit strangely. And down here we have beta over k. All right. So this is the actual refractive index from 0.8 to 1.5. And if we take the same diagram, we can plot the line for vacuum, which is 1. We can plot the line for silica, which is 1.46. And we can then put in the refractive index of the photonic crystal fiber cladding. And you can see the refractive index of the cladding is changing strongly with the frequency of the light. When the frequency increases, the refractive index gets higher. It's changing by quite a bit. It's quite a large change. So illustrating that the photonic crystal cladding is highly dispersive, that's to say the refractive index of the cladding changes strongly with frequency. And the reason why this is so, well, more cladding index step changes. Let me just anyway. So if we just think about this, and you can then work out how many guided modes the fiber may support, given that the refractive index is changing like this. And you can then use there's a well-known expression for the number of modes that a fiber can guide, and it's given by, it's proportional to the radius of the core squared. It makes sense. The area gets bigger, you get more modes, it goes with the square of that. If you reduce the vacuum wavelength, the number of modes go up, goes up as well. And it's the difference of the squares of the refractive index between the core and the cladding. And this, of course, is a highly dispersive number. And in fact, when you actually work this out, you find that as the wavelength lambda goes to naught, because of the dispersion of the refractive indices, the very particular kind of dispersion that this quantity has, it exactly cancels the lambda dependence as lambda goes to naught, and n tends to a constant, therefore. So as the wavelength gets smaller and smaller and smaller, the number of modes tends to a constant for a given structure. So this is the result, and as it's a consequence of the dispersion of the photonic crystal gives you. So we can plot the mode number, and I can put in square root of mode number versus frequency in this case, and we can see that this parameter goes up and reaches a threshold as lambda gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And if we change the ratio of the diameter of the hole to the spacing between the holes from 0.01 to 0.45, so this is a very large hole, this is a very small hole, that these curves move up. And in fact, we can actually these are very early measurements. This is a measurement at a long wavelength, 1.5 micron, of the near field of the light on top of the little air holes. And you can see that these contours are almost circular. So the light is more or less sampling the average refractive index in the cladding in this case. Whereas if we go to a shorter wavelength, 633 nanometers, the fields are much more perturbed by the presence of the air holes. And you can see the light is actually avoiding the air holes. And the light is concentrating itself into the silica. So comparing these two pictures, you would say that the refractive index seen by the light in the cladding, in this case, is quite a bit higher than the refractive index seen by the light in this case, because here the light is concentrated in the glass, whereas here it's also sampled in both. And in fact, as you see in this picture, this parameter gets bigger as the wavelength gets smaller, but it reaches up towards the asymptotic value. And in fact, you find by doing numerical modeling that the structural actus is single mode, provided these curves do not cross this dotted line. So that will go here. Okay, another interesting consequence is the numerical aperture of the line as it comes out. The numerical aperture is proportional to this B parameter I talked about, which tends to a constant as the wavelength gets very small. So in the short wavelength limit here, numerical aperture ends up being proportional to wavelength because the B parameter tends to a constant, and the only dependence you're left with is lambda. And so we get a sort of curious situation where long wavelength light diffracts more, and as we shorten the wavelength of light, the structure stays single mode, and so the numerical aperture of the fiber is itself a strong function of wavelength. Again, that's not something we think about. Fibers, the numerical aperture is fixed, it doesn't really depend on wavelength. But in this particular fiber, this particular kind of fiber, the numerical aperture is a strong function of wavelength. So you will see that the light, if the blue light comes out of the fiber, you get a small dot on the screen, and if you have red light, it will give you a large spread of the screen. Okay, so let me see. So can do with this this highly dispersive cladding effect, where the refractive index of the cladding is changing strongly with wavelength. So here's a plot again of wavelength versus refractive index. And here is the cladding index for a particular structure. It's changing on this diagram, it's changing quite a bit. And this is pure silica. 1. Whatever the value is, this is a pure silica line. If you could do something clever and you could dope the core with a material to reduce its refractive index. So this is the pure silica line. If you dope the silica with fluorine, you can actually reduce the refractive index by a small amount. It's quite a small amount, but it's enough to bring this line to the left, and enough so that we have a crossover between these two lines. Which means that as the refractive index, as the wavelength gets shorter, we start out with the core index, which is higher than the cladding, so we have total internal reflection. But then if you go to short enough wavelength, the refractive index difference switches, and anyway, the refractive index switches over, and it becomes an anti-value. So for long wavelength, it's a waveline. For short wavelength, it becomes leaky. And switches up. I'll switch this thing off.
10分钟休息时间。
Instead of 10 minutes, this is silly.
Just 2 minutes break. And then we can fully.
Oh, maybe just stop. Okay, alright, okay. You're right. So it's kind of hard to concentrate on it. But, okay, so this is a result which is really rather peculiar, because if you work in fiber optics, the general knowledge, what people understand is that as the wavelength gets shorter and shorter, you have more and more modes. The fiber guides better and better. It becomes easier and easier to guide light. It may become multi-mode, but it's still, which is not awfully nice for some application. But you never expect it to turn off guiding completely at some short wavelength. So this is like taking fiber optics and turning it on its head. It's just totally crazy in a way, this result. But it's true, and it works. So we did some experiments on this, and this was a fiber with a fluorine doped core, and choosing a wavelength 633, just PA neon, guided very nicely. So this meant you could bend the fiber, do all sorts of things to it, and the light stayed in the core. But then taking longer wavelengths, so these are laser lines from an argon laser system, 514 nanometers. It's just on the leaky side, and it's reasonably guided, but that's only when you keep the fiber straight. If you bend it even slightly, this light has disappeared from the core. And as we then reduce the wavelength, the light spreads out more and more, until it's more or less a cladding mode down here. And for all these wavelengths, you perturb the fiber even very slightly, the light leaks away. So it's kind of one of those dramatic consequences that we see by using photonic crystal ideas in structures like this. So I have a lot of topics here. Which one should I choose? Vision losses, certain structures? What interests you most?
I think most of them are not telecom, maybe laser structural analysis.
Laser structure.
Fabrication lots
They
mainly.
move away from telecom, that's a good idea, so I think we would. I think what might interest you perhaps most is the supercontinuum. So what I'll do is I'll jump to grid velocity dispersion because I need to do that first. So, good. So the feedback, and we'll jump on to something a little different. So this is a fiber which can be used for turning infrared pulses into very broad band white light, which is a very dramatic effect in the laboratory. It's a fiber which has a very small core, it's 800 nanometers in diameter, and we call it sometimes a grapefruit fiber because it looks like a cross section of a grapefruit. The hollow channels have become quite distorted, and there's lots and lots of air in the structure, so it has a very high fraction of air. So if we have an eye, dispersion is important here because dispersion, the chromatic dispersion, has an influence on the nonlinear optics. So if you want to do something like change the wavelength of light, you need to control the dispersion. So this is an important part of the discussion. So this is the chromatic dispersion, GBD versus wavelength, for bulk silica glass. And this is anomalous above the line, anomalous dispersion, normal dispersion below it. Bulk silica glass has normal dispersion in this wavelength range. But if we take the fiber with the 800 nanometer core and measure its dispersion, the mode is guided in here, it's dramatically different. It's been changed completely from the value of bulk silica glass. And in particular, we've moved the zero dispersion wavelength, which sits over here at 1.3. We've shifted it right down to 560 nanometers into the green wavelength range. The reason why this happens is, in fact, that as the holes in the fiber get bigger, so we start with small ones, we make them bigger and bigger, and you can see that the core is becoming more and more isolated from the cladding, and it starts, in fact, to look like a strand of silica glass sitting just in vacuum. It isn't quite that, of course, but it's close to that. And in fact, you can model the dispersion of the fibers reasonably accurately using a simple silica strand. You can work out the phase velocity, you can work out the group velocity, and you can work out the group velocity dispersion. And for this particular size of strand, it turns out there are two zero dispersion wavelengths. And these can be tuned to have their position almost anywhere in this range. You may say, what has that got to do with me? Why is that important? Well, the reason is that the reason it's important is that we can place the zero dispersion, as I said already, we can place the zero dispersion wavelength anywhere over a wide range, and there are lots of lasers in this range. There are lasers all the way from 532 even shorter out to 1.3, 800. There are lots and lots of different laser systems in that range. So this brings me on to the next thing. Just keep that in mind. Now let me jump to talking about femtosecond frequency codes here. So we want to take pulses from a laser system, which are relatively narrow in their range of frequencies. Maybe there's a high sapphire laser system. We want to broaden the spectrum. So what's the recipe for doing this? Well, there's a simple recipe. We take a solid core PCF, we design it so that its zero chromatic dispersion wavelength coincides with that of the laser that we want to use. What does this do for us? Well, the simplest explanation is that the absence of chromatic dispersion means that the energy packet of the pulse doesn't broaden as it travels. So you keep very high intensity over quite long distances. And this, of course, enhances nonlinear effects. What do I mean by nonlinear effects? Well, there are all kinds of things here, mostly care-related, but there's also random effects, Fourier mixing, self-phase modulation, self-steeping, lots of different effects. And if you're into nonlinear optics, you'll understand what these are. But you need them all. The most important ones in this case are Fourier mixing and self-phase modulation. You do quite often see salt transforming as well. But don't worry too much about that because the results are really amazing when you see this for the first time. So the invisible light is coming in here from the sapphire laser system. It goes into the fiber. It turns almost immediately into white light. And you don't actually need a long length of fiber. It's only long because the picture looks better when it was long. You could have quite a short length. And then we use a gradient to disperse the light onto a screen. And you see we have the entire visible spectrum. And it actually goes into the UV and out into the infrared. It's very dramatic, it's very, very bright, very efficient. And one particular application for this has to do with the measurement of frequency. It really is bright, by the way. So it turns out to be brighter than 10,000 suns. One application of this broadband light source is to measuring frequency. And in fact, it turns out that if you look at the spectrum, it consists of a cone of frequencies. And in fact, Hensch used these fibers to implement a system where he measured frequency with very high accuracy before that he won part of the Nobel Prize in 2005. Let me just talk a little bit about this. So, femtosecond frequency code, what exactly is this? Well, we are generating a broad band of frequencies from a mode block laser system. So the laser system is kicking out pulses regularly with a certain frequency. And in fact, if you look at the details of this spectrum, it has a whole lot of cones or ladders. There's a ladder of frequencies spaced by the repetition rate of the laser. Okay, frequency spacing plus rate of the laser. So to understand this, just briefly look at a mode log femtosecond laser. You can actually go to the Nobel website. This is explained very nicely by Ted Hench. So if you have a mode log laser system with an amplifying material inside it, and a mirror, two mirrors, of course, so the light is emitted out to the right. There's a certain round-trip time for light inside the cavity, and as in all systems where there's the presence of dispersion, the group velocity and the phase velocity are different numbers, they're different values. So this means, in fact, that the pulse round-trip time inside the cavity, which is determined by the group velocity, doesn't actually contain an integral number of optical oscillations. And this is another way of saying that the round-trip time for the phase velocity is different from the round-trip time for the group velocity. And these in general are the ratio of those two velocities is incommensurate in general relative to the length of the cavity, which means that every single pulse, each individual pulse is not identical coming out of the laser. But what does it look like? Although it may look as if each pulse is the same, if you actually look at the details of the fields, you'll find that the carrier wave, the optical oscillations underneath the pulses, are not exactly in the same position for each pulse. And there's a constant slippage in time as you go from pulse to pulse, delta t and 2 delta t and so on. And that has a consequence. If we take a Fourier transform of that, and we plot frequency versus the strength of the various field components, first of all, we find that there is a nice frequency cone. Of course, this is the light emitted by the laser. The repetition rate determines the spacing between the cones. That's 2 pi over this t. And we can extend this cone down and down and down and down in frequency, down to 0 frequency, and you'll find in general that it doesn't actually, the cone doesn't actually sit at 0 frequency, but there's an offset. This offset of frequency is something that you have to determine if you want to measure frequency accurately. In fact, this f0 is equal to delta t over t squared. So this f0 is proportional to this slippage in time from pulse to pulse. Now, why is this important, you may say? Well, quite simple. If you want to measure something, typically we use a ruler to measure distance. How do we do it? We want the distance between these two lines. We take our ruler, we very carefully put it in the right place. We have to position this as precisely as possible. And having done that, we can then measure off the distance. The trouble with the femtosecond frequency cone is that we don't quite know where the 0 is. There's an uncertainty in the 0 offset frequency because we haven't measured it. So we can't measure frequency very accurately. So in order to measure frequency accurately, we have to measure that frequency offset. So how do we do it? Well, to do this, we need to have a broadband source of light, which is at least 1 octave wide. So it has to be frequency, twice the frequency over here. And then this is Ted Hench's idea, a really nice idea. You take one of the lower frequencies, which would be the offset frequency, plus some integer times the repetition rate of the laser. So the 0 is down here, you just go up and up and up to this particular frequency. You then put this through a frequency doubling crystal. So we double this frequency and we get 2 into this, because that's what's coming out of here. And then we compare that with the high frequency end of the cone, where we have f0 again. But this time we have double the frequency, so it's 2n fr. Okay, so this is the frequency up here. And then we simply put both of these frequencies onto a detector. And the lowest frequency that you measure is f0, because these two frequencies cancel, and we get 2f0 minus f0, so we get the weak note. So we can measure the offset frequency very precisely and simply, provided provided the bandwidth of this cone is at least 1 octave wide. So this is the whole idea of the Ted Hench experiment, and in fact, the thing that was nice for us and for my group was that he was using our fiber to do this. work. But more widely, I mean, that's a very specific application of these these broadband light sources. But supercontinuum sources in general have become very important in all sorts of applications, from medicine, biology, to just about any kind of application where you need to have broadband, very bright white light. So the experiments on the femtosecond frequency cone required a mode-locked laser, which is very expensive. My sapphire laser system is a big expensive system. However, you can do the same thing with a handheld laser source, such as a microchip laser. You can get these things quite cheaply now. These are lasers that produce sub-nanosecond pulses at 1 micron wavelength, repetition rates in the kilohertz, and average powers of milliwatts in this case. And they operate at 106.4 nanometers. It's easy to design a PCF that has zero dispersion wavelength in this range. Here's an example of one. The solid core is quite big in this case, 6 micrometers. It has anomalous dispersion in this particular case. It's close to zero dispersion. And if you launch these pulses into this fiber and take a 20-meter length, we need a reasonably long length in this case because the peak powers are quite low. You could broaden the spectrum of the laser very dramatically. And here you're flat. You have a flat spectrum that's flat to within a factor of 2 over several hundred nanometers. And even nicer is that all the light generated, by this source is coming out of a single mode, because the fiber itself is one of these endlessly single mode fibers. So it's spatially coherent and very bright and has many applications. Here's an example of an even brighter source, which is delivering about 6.5 watts of supercontinuum, and the spectral brightness is about 5 milliwatts per nanometer over this wavelength range. This is a quite remarkable source. This is also interesting just to see how the impact that these results have had on the field of broadband light sources, the availability of broadband light sources over the last more or less 10 years. If you went back, say, 10 years, this is about right, we would probably have been using an incandescent lamp or some kind of lamp, at least halogen lamp maybe, for your experiments, because that's the only thing that was available at a reasonable price, and in fact you couldn't get anything really apart from that that was broad enough in wavelength range. You were getting maybe 10 nanowatts per nanometer brightness. At that time, you could have spent a lot of money, $100,000 or so, on a very expensive box from Hewlett-Packard that covered the communications band. That still wasn't all that bright. It was maybe 1 microwatt per nanometer. A simple PCF supercontinuum source based on the microchip laser, the one I just showed you, it gets you up to 10 microwatts per nanometer and even brighter. And that very bright source, the last one I showed you, was up at getting towards 10 kilowatts per nanometer. In fact, the most recent results are even brighter than that. And the bandwidth is enormous. It's going from blue right up to the infrared. So it's quite a pretty amazing source. So in the course of 10 years, we've gone from a broadband source, but the only one you could use that maybe if you were lucky gave you 10 watts per nanometer, to something that's 1 to maybe 6 orders of magnitude brighter, 1 billion times brighter spectrum. I think that number itself illustrates how important this is for many applications. Chemists and all sorts of people want this. People who build microscopes want these sources. You can also work with other materials. I did mention lead silicate, other glasses. These have high nonlinearities, so you can then use shorter lengths of fiber. You can also make PCFs using these other materials, using various approaches. And this particular work, where is this going? Well, having a higher nonlinearity, what this does for you is it means you can actually generate the frequency comb I talked about. You can generate this with much lower pulse energies because the nonlinearity is higher. And why should that be important? In this particular case, this is an experiment that was done with a mode-locked fiber laser pumping to generate a frequency cone spanning this range. People want to use this in space. The that they want to. They have astronomical applications on satellites, applications on space, where the idea is to measure frequency in space, but they would like to have the spacing between the cones of the frequency curve to be more like 10 gigahertz rather than just maybe 100 megahertz. And the only way to do it, the thing is, if you increase the Mundocking rate of a laser, the energy per pulse drops a lot. So it makes it more difficult to generate a supercontinuum. So what you need then is a fiber that has higher nonlinearity that can generate an octave spanning supercontinuum from much lower pulse energies. And this is where this work is heading. And we're working with the people in Munich at the National Institute for Quantum Optics on this. So I've got about 10 minutes. I'm going to jump to phonons and stuff like that. So now I'm going to switch gear a little bit, and in the last 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about the interaction of acoustic vibrations and light, phonons and photons. So just to give you a kind of feel for where this is going, if we think about acoustic vibrations in an optical fiber, so here's a single mode fiber, conventional single mode fiber with a core that's 9 micrometers in diameter. And of course, you know, at room temperature, everything's vibrating. You kind of know that KT is driving vibrations, everything you look at. In fibers, it's exactly the same thing. It's driven by KT. And the vibrations of a structure like this, the acoustic vibrations, are really not confined to the core, because the acoustic properties of the core are so close to that of the cladding that there's very little acoustic confinement of the vibrations of the core. So the entire structure is vibrating. There's lots of complicated different frequencies of vibration. And in fact, you can measure these vibrations using optical techniques. And there's a whole field of guided acoustic vector mass scattering, which dates back a long way, where people have studied this. If you go to PCF, it has more or less the same outer diameter, but inside the fiber, you're going to find a very fine periodic structure, and right in the middle, there's going to be a tiny core, perhaps. And this is a particular example. The core is about 1 micrometer in diameter. It has very large air holes. The glass core is cut off from the outside world. And in fact, in this case, you can find that there are acoustic vibrations that are very strongly confined to the core, because they're strongly reflected back to the core when you hit the core boundary. In this case, any acoustic wave will just pass straight through the core and not be reflected. In this case, it's a very strong reflection. This has interesting consequences for the interaction of sound and light. To illustrate this, we can look at the classical dispersion relation for phonons for a diatomic lattice. Just to give you an illustration of this, a structure like this, a one-dimensional structure, frequency versus wave vector, has an acoustic branch and an optical branch. And the acoustic branch, these are basically regular acoustic waves just traveling through the lattice. These give rise to stimulated Riemann scattering. And this is a backward scattering effect where the frequency wave vector diagram, where the light that is traveling forwards, this is the dispersion line for the light, so the light in the core traveling forwards is scattered into a backward traveling Stokes light with a frequency shift omega. And this is done by means of an acoustic phonon that can actually scatter the light backwards. So that's Riemann scattering. What I want to talk about here, is scattering not in the Riemann sense, but in using the optical branch as the upper branch of this Riemann dispersion relation. And you notice that it's very flat here. It comes up, it becomes flat, and you have a cutoff frequency. And this cutoff frequency, in fact, is related to the Raman scattering frequency. And if we put on the same diagram the dispersion of light, frequency versus wave vector, it's almost a vertical line. And this vertical line crosses the phonon line at a particular point. And at that point, the acoustic vibrations are phase matched to the light. So you get a very strong interaction at that point. So now jumping to the fibers, here is the fiber with the tiny core. And the acoustic vibration is tightly confined inside it. If we think about the acoustic vibrations, first of all, frequency versus wave vector, as we reduce the frequency of the acoustic vibrations, the mode trapped in the core follows this curve. And at a certain frequency, that particular acoustic resonance in the core was cut off. So it's a cut-off frequency. And you notice that this is very flat. And because it's a very flat branch, it resembles very strongly the optical phonon branch that I showed you a moment ago for that diatonic lattice. But it's flat. And this has a consequence that if we think about the light guided in the core now, we go to a very high frequency, we have an optical dispersion that, say, sits on this line. This is the light guided in the core. We can choose a frequency for the light that's guided in the core, and you can easily find an acoustic phonon or a trapped phonon in the core that has the same slope as this slope of the optical dispersion line. And this means that this particular phonon is able to phase match to lots of other frequencies of the light. So we can scatter light into many other frequencies and everything is phase matched. And this looks in fact very much like Raman scattering. For example, if we change the frequency of the laser light, the frequency, the Raman frequency shift does not change because it's simply the cut-off frequency. And in fact what we've done here is to take acoustic phonons and turn them into something that looks much more like optical phonons because of the flatness of the branch. Now this has a lot of consequences. One thing is that the light and the acoustic vibrations are both tightly trapped in the core. Everything is phase matched. So we have a highly nonlinear system. We can generate new frequencies of light using this interaction. You do see some interesting types of modes. These are movies that don't work so well on my computer for some reason. But you get different kinds of mode. This vibration in the core is a kind of squash mode. It's something that does this. Then this particular one generates birefringence. And another kind of breathing mode, where the mode simply breathes in and out, generates changes in refractive index. So you have these two different types of mode. You can measure them in different ways. The details here. But something you can do with these resonances is control them coherently. So if we have a resonance in the core, and this is time, and this is the resonance in the core, we can hit with short pulses. In this case, we have a 50-second duration. We can hit with short pulses that are very precisely timed. So if we time them so that the resonance is cancelled, we can cancel the vibration in the core. And if we time them so that there's reinforcement, we can actually make the resonance in the core stronger. This works quite nicely. Here's the structure that we used. This was a single pulse response. So we're measuring vibration in the core using an interferometric technique. You can see it vibrating in some sort of lifetime. We hit the two pulses in phase. It's a stronger vibration. We hit the two pulses out of phase. We very rapidly kill the vibration. And finally, something we did only very recently is that we can pump this system with two frequencies of laser light that are matched to the Raman frequency, the frequency in the core. And by doing this, we get a very strong nonlinear response and can generate lots of new frequencies. So here are some results of this. So this was a system where the